You wake up in 18th century Britain. The air stinks of soot, open sewers and horse manure. But that's not the problem. The real problem is that a single wrong move, a drunken night out, a petty theft, even just insulting the wrong person, could land you in punishment so grotesque, so unimaginable, you'd pray for death to come quickly. Welcome to a world where justice wasn't blind. It was theatrical, brutal, and designed to make an example out of you in the bloodiest way possible. Let's start with a punishment so extreme it makes modern-day prison sentences look merciful. Public execution by hanging wasn't just about killing someone. It was about turning their death into a performance for thousands. The condemned would be paraded to the gallows, often in a cart with a rope already around their neck. Crowds of men, women, and even children gathered like it was the hottest ticket in town. Vendors sold food, ale, and souvenirs, while people jostled for the best view of the drop. But here's the grotesque twist. The drop wasn't designed to snap the neck instantly. No, in many cases, it was deliberately short, ensuring the condemned dangled for minutes, sometimes even half an hour, kicking, clawing at their throats, slowly strangling while the audience roared. For the crowd, this was entertainment. For the condemned, it was a drawn-out nightmare. And if you were unlucky enough to have friends in the audience, they might rush forward and yank on your legs to speed up your death out of pity. Imagine your loved ones killing you faster to end your suffering. That was justice in the 18th century. But execution wasn't always the end. In fact, sometimes it was just the beginning. After hanging, criminals convicted of the most heinous crimes, especially murderers, were sentenced to something called gibbeting. Once you were dead, your body was placed in an iron cage and hung in a public place, often by a roadside, where travelers could see your corpse swinging in the wind. Birds picked at your flesh, rain rotted your skin, and your bones clattered in the breeze for months or even years. The purpose? To remind everyone that crime literally did not pay. The smell alone carried the message before you even saw the cage. Families of the dead often begged for the bodies back for burial, but the law refused. The body didn't belong to the family anymore. It belonged to the state, to rot as a warning to every passerby. Now, not every crime deserves death. Sometimes, the punishment was about humiliation, breaking your spirit before breaking your body. Picture this: you're caught swindling money, or maybe spreading lies about your neighbor. The sentence: the pillory, a wooden frame with holes for your head and hands, set up in a busy marketplace. You'd be locked in place for hours, unable to move, while the entire town hurled rotten vegetables, mud, dead animals, and occasionally stones at your face. You didn't just suffer physical pain, you suffered the collective hatred of your community. People laughed, mocked, and spat at you. The pillory turned punishment into a community sport, and if you were unlucky enough to anger the crowd too much, you might leave with permanent injuries, or not leave at all. Some died right there, crushed under the weight of the public's fury. But if you think the pillory was humiliating, wait until you hear about the drunkard's cloak. In certain towns, being caught drunk in public meant you'd be shoved into a massive wooden barrel with holes cut for your head, arms, and legs. You'd be paraded through the streets like a walking cask of ale, a living joke for everyone to jeer at. It was uncomfortable, degrading, and exhausting. But worse, it marked you as a fool to the entire town. Everyone knew your weakness, and the humiliation clung to you long after the punishment ended. It wasn't just your body that suffered, your reputation was permanently branded. Now let's turn to one of the most bizarre and terrifying forms of punishment: pressing or peine forte et judice. Refusing to enter a plea in court was treated as defiance against the king's justice. And how did they deal with defiance? They tied you to the ground and stacked heavy stones and weights onto your chest, slowly, relentlessly, until your ribs cracked, your lungs collapsed, and you either agreed to speak or died in silence under the crushing weight. Some prisoners resisted on purpose. Why? Because if they died without entering a plea, their property wasn't confiscated by the crown, meaning their families could inherit their wealth. Imagine choosing to be crushed to death, inch by inch, for the sake of protecting your children's future. That's how brutal and unforgiving the system was. And if your crime was forgery, say counterfeiting money, you wouldn't get off easy either. The punishment was burning, not burning at the stake, but burning of your hands. You'd be brought before a judge, a hot iron brand glowing red beside you, and forced to watch as it was pressed into the flesh of your palm. The smell of seared skin filled the courtroom as everyone witnessed the mark of your crime. From that day on, anyone who shook your hand would know exactly what you'd done. It wasn't just pain, it was permanent stigma, a living scar that spoke louder than words. But branding wasn't the only permanent reminder of crime. Whipping was another favorite. Public whippings were scheduled events, with criminals tied to posts and lashed until their backs split open. The sound of leather cracking across skin mixed with the cries of pain, echoing through town squares. And here's where it gets darker. Sometimes whipping wasn't a standalone punishment, it was paired with transportation. That meant after being publicly humiliated and scarred, you were shipped across the ocean to penal colonies like Australia or the Americas, where you'd serve out your sentence in forced labor. You didn't just lose your freedom, you lost your country, your home and your family, all in one brutal sweep. And then there were punishments designed to terrify with sheer creativity. Take the punishment for women accused of being scolds or gossipers, the scold's bridle. It was an iron muzzle that locked around the head, with a flat piece of metal shoved into the mouth to press down on the tongue. Once it was strapped on, the woman couldn't speak, couldn't shout, couldn't even swallow properly. She'd be paraded through the streets while people jeered, her silence forced by cold iron. It was punishment, humiliation, and silencing all at once. The grotesque part. Many of the women targeted weren't dangerous criminals. They were just wives or neighbors who annoyed the wrong men. But let's not leave men out of this theater of pain. In the Navy, desertion or mutiny could mean a flogging around the fleet. This meant the condemned sailor was rowed from ship to ship, tied up, and whipped in front of the crew of each vessel. Sometimes dozens of ships, hundreds of men, and miles of coastline. Each lash tore open flesh, salt air stinging the wounds, and by the end, the sailor was either broken beyond repair or dead before the last ship was reached. The punishment wasn't just for the sailor, it was a warning to every man watching, loyalty or death. If the punishments so far sound unbearable, brace yourself, because the 18th century had ways of ensuring your suffering extended long before and after the actual sentence. Take flogging at the cart's tail, a punishment for petty thefts and moral offenses. You'd be tied to the back of a cart and dragged through the streets of your town while being whipped the entire way. The whip tore into your skin as cobblestones scraped your feet, and the jeers of neighbors followed you from one end of the city to the other. There was no hiding afterward. Everyone had seen you, everyone knew what you had done, and your body carried the evidence in open wounds. Even after they healed, the scars screamed your guilt louder than any confession. But sometimes pain wasn't enough. The authorities wanted terror, and that's where drawing and quartering made its horrific entrance. Though more common for crimes like high treason, this punishment remained active well into the 18th century. It began with hanging, but not enough to kill. You'd dangle until half dead, cut down, and then the real torment began. Your body was disemboweled, your organs ripped out in front of you, and finally your limbs hacked off and displayed on city gates or bridges. The head, boiled in tar, was placed on a pike as a permanent reminder to anyone passing by. These weren't just punishments, they were state-sponsored horror shows. The message was clear: challenge authority, and your very body would be dismantled piece by piece, turned into a grotesque billboard for obedience. And not every grotesque act came from men in robes or executioners with axes. Sometimes it was ordinary citizens, armed with the law's permission, who carried out justice. The punishment for cheating bakers, those who sold underweight bread, was to be dragged through the streets on a sled with the offending loaf hung around their neck. What started as humiliation could spiral into something far worse if the crowd turned violent. People hurled stones, dung, or anything they could grab, turning a punishment of shame into a public bloodletting. Imagine being battered not just by the law, but by the fury of every hungry stomach in your town. And if you think punishments ended with the physical, the 18th century had another trick: punishment through theater. Take the crime of perjury. If you were caught lying under oath, you could be sentenced to stand in the pillory with a sign declaring perjurer on your chest. That label clung to you forever. Courts knew reputational ruin could destroy a man more effectively than a rope. In a society built on trust, losing your word was losing your life. But let's go even darker. One punishment, particularly grotesque in its design, was reserved for women accused of infanticide: the burning at the stake. While men guilty of similar crimes might face hanging, women could be condemned to the flames, bound to a post, faggots piled at their feet. The fire was lit, and their bodies consumed while crowds gawked. Even in the 18th century, where Enlightenment ideals were rising, this ancient spectacle survived, a stark reminder that progress often limped while cruelty ran. Not every crime earned such finality, though many earned punishments are designed to haunt you every day afterward. For thieves, that often meant transportation. After being publicly punished, sometimes whipped through the streets, you'd be loaded onto a ship and sent thousands of miles away to penal colonies in North America, or later, Australia. The voyage alone was a punishment: cramped holds, disease, filth, and months at sea. By the time you arrived, survival wasn't guaranteed. And even if you did live, freedom was a memory. You were labor, property, a criminal exiled forever from your home. In many ways, transportation was a slow-motion death sentence, stretching agony across an ocean and a lifetime. But for crimes of speech, mockery, slander, or disturbing sermons, there were punishments aimed at silencing you. One of the most grotesque: the tongue piercing. If you spread seditious words, authorities might have your tongue run through with a hot iron. The wound left you unable to speak clearly again, branding your very voice as criminal. Words became scars. Imagine opening your mouth for the rest of your life, only to have people hear not your defense, not your ideas, but the permanent lisp of your punishment. And the grotesquerie didn't stop at adults. Children too were caught in this brutal system. In an age when poverty was rampant, children often stole food simply to survive. The punishment, often the same as adults: public whipping, pillory, even hanging for repeat offenses. There are records of children as young as 7 swinging from gallows, their small bodies left dangling before crowds that had gathered as if for a festival. The message wasn't just to the child, it was to every parent watching: keep your children in line or the rope will claim them too. But let's not forget the punishments reserved for soldiers, because the military didn't believe in leniency. Desertion could mean execution, but often it meant a punishment called running the gauntlet. Soldiers were forced to march between 2 lines of comrades, each armed with sticks, whips, or switches, beating the deserter as he passed. The line could stretch hundreds of men long. The soldier would collapse from blood loss, bruises, and broken bones, but if he survived, he was forced to march the line again. Death was likely, but survival wasn't mercy. It was a broken body and a ruined man, left as an example of what happened when duty failed. And then there's the punishment of ducking stools for women accused of being disorderly, often meaning nothing more than being outspoken, quarrelsome, or accused of witchcraft. They'd be strapped to a wooden chair attached to a long beam, dunked repeatedly into freezing rivers or ponds, and hauled back up, gasping for breath, only to be submerged again. The entire town gathered on bridges and banks to watch, laughing as the woman choked and sputtered, her body dragged through mud and sewage. Officially, it wasn't meant to kill, but drownings weren't rare. Sometimes survival wasn't even the point, the spectacle was. By now you might be thinking death was the worst fate, but in the 18th century, sometimes survival was worse. Criminals sentenced to whipping or branding, once released, carried the visible, permanent proof of their crime. Society didn't forgive. Employers didn't hire. Neighbors didn't forget. You weren't just punished once, You were punished every day afterward. Walking down the street, everyone's eyes reminded you you were guilty, and you would always be guilty. That was the grotesque genius of 18th century justice. It wasn't about rehabilitation, it was about permanent damnation in the eyes of your community. And just when you think the system couldn't invent anything more nightmarish, there's the punishment of hanging in chains alive. Rare, but real. In some cases of treason, criminals were locked in iron cages and hanged before death had even come. There, exposed to the elements, they starved, dehydrated, and wasted away while crows pecked at their faces and insects burrowed into their skin. The public gathered to watch, not a death, but a slow unraveling of life, stretched into days of torment. By the time death finally came, the spectacle was already burned into the memories of every witness. If you thought the punishments we've covered so far stretched the limits of cruelty, the 18th century still had more horrors in store, especially when religion got involved. Courts weren't just protecting property and order, they were protecting morality, and sins against the church could earn you some of the most humiliating and grotesque sentences imaginable. Take the punishment for blasphemy. Insulting God, mocking scripture, or ridiculing the clergy wasn't just dangerous, it was criminal. And if you were convicted, you could find yourself standing in the pillory, branded with a hot iron on your cheek or forehead with the letters B or BL. The mark was permanent, burning through skin into memory. Some offenders even had their ears nailed to the wood of the pillory itself, then sliced off when their time was up. Imagine leaving court not just with scars, but missing body parts that screamed your crime louder than any confession. You weren't just punished in the moment, you became a walking sermon about the price of irreverence. And for women accused of immorality, whether adultery, prostitution, or simply living outside the expected roles, there were punishments designed to destroy their dignity in public. One was the whipping cart. Women were stripped to the waist, tied to a cart, and dragged through town while lashes rained down on their backs. Crowds, whipped into righteous anger, hurled insults, garbage, and stones. It wasn't just about pain, it was about turning the woman into a symbol of disgrace, paraded for all to see, until the punishment itself became as much a performance for the community as it was an ordeal for the accused. But some punishments weren't about public display at all. They were about the slow grind of suffering in private. In debtors' prisons, people who owed money were confined for years in filthy cells, crammed with others, disease festering in the air. Many never emerged alive. Technically, debtors weren't criminals, but their punishment was a slow decay in the shadows, dying by inches for the crime of poverty. Some prisoners begged to be transported across the sea just to escape the rotting walls of debtors' prison. At least transportation offered a chance, however slim, of survival. And if you think the system had any mercy for beggars, you'd be wrong. Laws against vagrancy and begging were mercilessly enforced. In many towns, only the visibly disabled were allowed to beg. If you were caught faking a limp or pretending to be blind, the punishment could be hanging. Yes, death for desperation. And yet, despite the risk, countless poor people tried it anyway. Hunger was a stronger force than fear. And when they were caught, their deaths became another grim lesson carved into the collective memory of their communities. But let's pause for a moment and talk about one punishment that straddled the line between spectacle and nightmare: the breaking wheel. Though more common in continental Europe, records show it was occasionally used in Britain during the 18th century. The condemned would be strapped to a large wooden wheel, their limbs splayed across the spokes. An executioner wielded an iron bar, shattering bones one by one, starting at the legs, then the arms working inward. Each strike broke a limb but left the victim alive, howling in agony. Finally, with their body reduced to a mangled ruin, the wheel was raised upright, and the criminal was left to die slowly under the sun, the crows circling overhead. Even when not used, the threat of the wheel haunted the imagination. It was the bogeyman of punishments. Everyone knew what it meant, and everyone prayed they'd never see it in person. And while the wheel symbolized slow, crushing agony, The punishment of execution by burning was meant to terrify through fire. Though increasingly rare in the 18th century, it was still used for crimes like counterfeiting or treason. Bound to a stake, surrounded by kindling, the condemned faced the horror of flames devouring their body. Sometimes executioners, out of pity, strangled victims before the fire truly caught. But when they didn't, the screams echoed far beyond the square, carried on the wind into the nightmares of every witness. For sailors, punishments could be even stranger. One particularly grotesque method of execution at sea was keel hauling. The condemned was tied with ropes and dragged under the hull of a ship, scraping against barnacles and wood before being pulled back up on the opposite side. If he survived, the sea filled the lungs, the barnacles ripped flesh to ribbons, and survival usually meant infection and slow death later. Naval justice wasn't just about discipline, it was about instilling terror so deep that men thought twice before disobeying orders again. But punishments weren't always fatal or bloody. Some were simply designed to make you wish you were anywhere else. In some villages, habitual gossips or quarrelers were forced into cucking stools, strapped into a chair fixed to a beam. They were dunked again and again into icy rivers, choking, sputtering, gasping, then plunged back under. The humiliation was as sharp as the cold. Neighbors cheered and laughed from the banks, turning someone's torment into a community's amusement. It wasn't technically meant to kill, but drowning accidents happened, and when they did, the crowd simply shrugged. After all, the law had spoken. But here's where the grotesque genius of 18th century punishments truly shines. They weren't only about punishing the body, they were about punishing the soul. Branding, whipping, pillories, and mutilations were designed to turn you into a living warning sign. You couldn't escape your past. You carried it on your face, your back, your voice. Society became the jailer, every glance a reminder, every whisper a sentence that never ended. And if you think all of this was random cruelty, think again. Every punishment was calculated to terrify, to humiliate, to warn. A public hanging wasn't just about one criminal's death, it was about keeping thousands obedient. A branding wasn't just about marking one man's hand, it was about ensuring the whole town knew what betrayal looked like. The 18th century turned punishment into theater, a grotesque stage where every criminal was both actor and victim, and the audience was everyone else. But the stage could be crueler still. Imagine being sentenced not just to pain, but to slow starvation in a cage, or being lashed so severely your flesh peeled in ribbons, then paraded before the very people you'd once called neighbors. Imagine being silenced forever by a piece of iron forced into your mouth, or being forced to march to the edge of the world in chains, never to see your home again. These weren't just punishments, they were erasures of identity, reducing people to nothing more than examples. And yet, perhaps the most grotesque part isn't the methods themselves, but the fact that so many were carried out in broad daylight, with communities cheering, mocking, laughing. Punishment wasn't hidden behind prison walls. It was woven into daily life. Children grew up watching men whipped bloody, women gagged in iron masks, and thieves dangling lifeless in cages by the roadside. Brutality wasn't an exception. It was normal. By the late 18th century, the world was shifting. Enlightenment ideals were spreading. Philosophers were questioning cruelty, and whispers of reform were growing louder. But while the pens of thinkers scratched away in quiet studies, the streets still echoed with the cries of those punished in the old ways. Change was coming, yes, but for the condemned of that century, mercy remained an illusion. One of the strangest punishments to survive well into the 17th century was post-mortem desecration. If you committed a crime considered heinous enough, like murdering a master or rebelling against the crown, the punishment didn't end with your execution. Surgeons were given your body for dissection in front of paying crowds. In an age obsessed with anatomy and medical science, criminals became unwilling cadavers, their remains prodded and sliced while spectators leaned in, both horrified and fascinated. For some, this was worse than death itself. Burial was sacred, a final rest, to be denied that to have your body displayed, dissected, and discarded like refuse was considered a fate that shamed not just the criminal, but their entire family. And then there was the punishment of amputation for theft. Though less common by the 18th century, it was still carried out in some cases. A hand, the tool of the crime, was chopped off publicly, the bleeding stump cauterized with boiling oil or fire. The crowd cheered, the smell of burnt flesh clung to the air, and the thief staggered away, forever marked by absence. Imagine trying to rebuild a life in a society where survival often required two hands to work, to eat, to defend yourself. Justice wasn't just about retribution, it was about rendering you useless, a living warning branded not by scars, but by absence itself. But perhaps the punishment that best captures the grotesque imagination of the 18th century was the punitive spectacle of transportation and exile. Thousands were herded onto prison ships, hulks that rotted on the Thames, before being ferried to distant colonies. Conditions on these ships were so brutal that many died before ever seeing land, and for those who survived the voyage, the colonies offered no freedom. Chained labor under a burning sun, disease, starvation. It was punishment stretched into years, decades, entire lifetimes. The rope could kill you in minutes. Exile killed you in pieces. And yet, even with all these grotesque spectacles, the most chilling truth is this: these punishments were not hidden. They weren't carried out in secret dungeons, whispered about in shadow. They were performed in open daylight, with communities gathering like it was a festival. Children were perched on shoulders, vendors sold beer and pies, and laughter mingled with screams. Punishment wasn't just a sentence, it was entertainment, a ritual, a spectacle everyone participated in. The 18th century didn't just punish criminals, it taught the public to hunger for the sight of it. It's tempting to look back and think we're different now, that we've evolved beyond the grotesque theaters of pain and humiliation. But have we? We may not gather in the square to watch bodies twist on the rope, but crowds still gather online, feasting on humiliation, mocking the downfall of others in digital pillories. We may not brand hands with hot irons, but reputations are still scorched permanently in the court of public opinion. The tools have changed, but the appetite for spectacle lingers. And that's what makes the punishments of the 18th century so haunting. They weren't just barbaric acts of a brutal age. They were mirrors showing us how far people will go to control, to warn, to entertain, even at the cost of another human's dignity. They remind us that cruelty isn't just about chains and whips. It's about the need to watch, to judge, to reduce someone's life to a lesson for others. So picture it. The cart dragging you through the cobbled streets as the whip cracks behind you. The pillory locks your head and hands, while the crowd hurls filth at your face. The rope is tightening around your neck as thousands cheer. Would you have survived the grotesque punishments of the 18th century? Or would you, like so many before, have been reduced to another spectacle, another warning, another name lost in the shadows of history's cruelest stage?